I had just finished my senior year of college and was only staying in my college town to ride out the rest of my apartment lease. My lease was set to end in about a week, and my roommate had already left to return to his hometown looking for work. So that made my apartment pretty empty, which I didn't mind because I was almost never there anyways. I should mention that I always had a terrible habit of leaving my apartment front door unlocked because I forgot my keys constantly and knew my neighbors fairly well. At this point, I was also incredibly apathetic about everything because I was leaving my job and college behind very soon and was just pretty eager to say goodbye to my college town for good. This last week was dragging on, and throughout the course of it, I noticed some strange things started to happen. Small bits of food would go missing. Nothing obvious though, so I thought I just assumed I had eaten it already and forgotten about it. I also would hear muffled moving noises, kind of like someone tiptoeing through an old house or something. I never thought too much of it considering my mind was elsewhere, and I was eager to be leaving, so I'd always come up with more logical conclusions to what could be happening. On the last day of my lease, I had all of my stuff ready and packed into my car, and was about to turn my key into the office, when my roommate called me. He asked if I could take one last look around the apartment to see if I could find a flash drive he might have left there, even though he was pretty sure it wasn't there. I agreed, and headed back up to the apartment. I took one half-assed look and told him I couldn't find it, to which he responded, "Can you check my old room really quick?" Now, him and I always kept our doors shut, and that tradition didn't change after he moved out, so I hadn't opened the door to his room once. I expected to find nothing in there, considering he had moved out weeks ago, but when I opened the door, I found an old sleeping bag, some ratty clothes, and a couple of opened food packages. After seeing this, I asked him if he had left any of these items, but he seemed confused and told me he didn't even have a sleeping bag. Hearing this freaked me out, and I left the apartment, turned in my key, and drove out of that town. I can only conclude that someone was living in that apartment with me for a couple of days, and banked on the fact that I always left the door unlocked. To this day, I never go back to that town to visit, and I never plan to. When I was a little girl, I lived in a neighborhood 2 streets from the school with a cluster of children all around me. It was the idyllic place that all parents would hope to raise their suburban kids. There were kids of all ages that went to our school, and we would all walk together down the cul-de-sac with a pathway that led up from the park into the school around a winding hillside. My older brother and I were 2 years apart, and we both had that perfect group of friends in our neighborhood. My brother, Christian, was friends with the boys across the street, Dylan and Nathan. Next door to Dylan and Nathan, who were brothers, lived Alec and Spencer. The two weren't favorites around the neighborhood, as the young Spencer had a habit of being a bully, and Alec was just generally not a very polite person. Dylan and Nathan weren't much better, having had a reputation towards temper and petty theft. My set of friends consisted of our next-door neighbor, Joanna, and really no one else. We would often play with our dolls in the safety of Joanna's garage, where we would sit on the ground and make musicals with our boomboxes to fit the stories of our dolls. The boys, conversely, were more into their biking and skateboarding tricks. It was a comfortable way of life. The odd ones out of the street were the neighbors to the left of us, an isolated Chinese family with one son in my grade. His name was David. David was a strange boy, tall and lanky with buzzed black hair and glasses. He always wore blue long-sleeved shirts and had an odd smell about him. He was fastidiously neat and kept to himself more often than not, though a boy from my grade, Heo, would come to play Yu-Gi-Oh cards with him in his garage sometimes. David didn't have many friends on the block, and I never much paid him mind. He and I lived in 2 different worlds. I didn't think much of David until the 4th grade, when things started to take an unusual turn. David would be seen in the middle of the night standing in the street and staring at the houses, unmoving for what seemed like hours. Then, he would simply turn and walk back into his house without a word or action. He would just stand outside of the view of the streetlight and be a dark silhouette standing in the middle of the unoccupied road. It was odd, but no one much seemed to notice except for Joanna and me, so we let it go. That is, until one night when Joanna and I, against the advice of our parents, went out on our bikes past sundown. It was pitch black, but we had kept to the confines of the neighborhood and the road to the edge of the street and back, pretending to be adventurers seeking ingredients for a magic potion. Weeds and flowers, innocently stolen from people's gardens under the cover of darkness. We rode around the back end of the neighborhood and were returning to Joanna's yard when we noticed him, standing at the edge of the street lamp and staring at us with his head cocked to the side. At first, we didn't think much of it and continued to ride onward. As we grew closer, however, we both started to get an off feeling and slowed down until it was difficult to pedal our bicycles, hoping that he would move if we gave him enough time to. He didn't. I made the decision to speed up just to get past him as quickly as possible, and Joanna followed suit. We made it past without incident, but once we were a good few feet away, he turned and started to chase after us. We picked up speed and hammered down the street, swerving into her driveway and into her garage, shutting it behind us and scrambling up to her bedroom, the window of which faced the street. I tore back the curtains and caught the image of David. He calmly walked back to where he had been and stood there for a solid 5 minutes before he turned and walked back inside. Unnerved and anxious, Joanna and I spent most of the night in an eerie silence. Neither of us knew what to make of David's sudden action. We didn't know what to call it. It wasn't an attack, but it certainly wasn't passive. I stayed another night at her home before going home, but by then had all but forgotten about David's odd behavior. I wish I'd told my parents about it then. Maybe it would have taken some of the shock out of what happened next. A few weeks went by without any incident, and by then, school had started again, and I was a new 4th grader, excited to have my brother's old teacher and a class full of familiar friends and fun activities. I was always a teacher's pet, and a pretty smart kid, so school was always fun for me. It was about 2 weeks into the school year before the odd things started to occur. At first, it was minor. There would be black streaks on the pavement as I walked home, and the dog at the end of the street just before the crosswalk was more aggressive than ever, barking and snarling and snapping at the fences as though he was somehow provoked. I didn't think much of it though, and kept walking without any fear. I had no way of predicting just what would happen that week. It was the following Saturday that I noticed David's garage was hanging open, and he was playing cards with some of the boys on my block. My brother was steering clear and hanging out with some of his friends from a few blocks away, Marty, while Dylan, Nathan, Spencer, and Alec played cards with the usually reclusive David. Confused, but happy for him, I went in to play with Joanna and chit-chat the way only little girls do. We spent a while blasting whatever mixtape CDs we could scrounge up, before we started hearing the shouting from the street. We both shot up and peeked out to see David shoving Nathan, who was very well renowned for being the kind to be physically intimidating, and the two shouting unintelligibly. For a change, David was being the antagonist, not Nathan. Neither Joanna or I could comprehend the idea, and stared in dumb shock at the scene unfolding before us. The boys got progressively louder, and more violent, while Dylan and Alec just stared. I considered going to them and asking them what was happening, but that would have required walking past the two basically brawling little boys between us. Surprisingly, no adults came out to stop them, so it had to naturally fizzle on its own. It wasn't until Nathan shouted something about Alec that David abruptly pulled away and walked inside, barking at the boys in his garage to get out and shutting the door behind them when they did. Spencer, being the angry kid he was, spat curses David's way and marched off with his brother back to his house across the street. I approached Dylan. I wasn't very close to Nathan as a general rule, to ask him what he knew. He was screaming at us about his cards, he told me. He just started yelling and screaming about us stealing his cards. He sounded confused. He shook his head and continued off towards my brother and his, getting into some conversation or another about video games. Uneasy, I returned to Joanna and explained what I could just get a grasp on, which wasn't much. The two of us decided to head into her house and up to her bedroom for a while and shut up the garage, just in case. It wasn't until the next day that things started to get really out of hand, though. It was later into the afternoon that Sunday when Alex's garage seemed to just light up, smoke pouring out from the slightly lifted bottom and orange light visible within. We all panicked, but luckily Alex's father made quick work of putting out the flames, and the garage was lifted to air out and reveal the damage. There was a small pile in the center of the garage of scrapped paper crumpled together and used kind of like kindling to start a fire, but there was no other evidence to suggest who had done it. Despite the lack of evidence, it was a consensus in the neighborhood just who had done it. David. It wasn't until then that I'd started putting things together. The burn marks in Alex's garage looked just like the burn marks on the sidewalk that day I had walked home from school. Same dark char, same light fade. The same burns, leading all the way down the crosswalk on the side of the street David and I always took. No one ever called the police, and looking back on it, I wish they had. Maybe then David could have faced some punishment for his actions. No one knew that it was David for a few days, but everyone suspected. He would snicker and jeer at us with his dark, brooding eyes, as though it was some twisted justice. It wasn't until a few days passed that we got our confirmation. David told Alec and his brother during a fight that they should be careful, lest it be them on fire next. The way he said it sends shivers down my spine just thinking of it. To think that a child in 4th grade could be quite so menacing is an odd proposition, but one I lived through though. David's abuse only grew more volatile as time went on. My father had a reputation for being a rather scary man when he was angry, so David never attacked me or my brother. But that didn't stop him from stalking me throughout the school. I'd catch him watching me and smirking, twirling his fingers as though he was holding something unseen. He looked downright psychopathic. I would see him pass down the street in his car with his mother, and he would mouth obscenities at me, smirk, and flip me the bird on a regular basis. We were all afraid to go near him or his house, and his friend Heo would come over more and more often to mock us and bully the girls on the street, namely me and Joanna, and lately, my visiting cousin. He and Heo went so far as to bash my cousin's head off a metal bar in a competition. She, in fairness, should have known better than to start. We barely made it home with her loopy and stumbling over her feet. The neighborhood kids tried to tell David's parents, but they did nothing to stop his behavior or put him into check. Honestly, I'm not sure they ever believed we were telling the truth about David. Regularly, there would be rumors of things catching on fire in David's garage, flickers of light and burnt remains of t-shirts left around for the world to see. While he never made such a bold move as to set someone else's house on fire, I'm terrified to think what he would have done if someone else would have set him off. No one went to David's garage after that, and people actively avoided him when he would come outside. For the year and a half before I moved out of the neighborhood and city, I would catch glimpses of David late in the night standing in the street or playing with a lighter in his driveway. I'm still afraid to think of what David might have done if given a chance or motivation, but I'm simply glad I'm no longer the person he might catch late at night. I dread to think what might have happened if I had been. So I'm a male nurse at a large hospital in San Francisco. I work in the ER, and as is custom Thanksgiving night, it was very busy. My wife is also a nurse for the same hospital. She works in labor and delivery. Between babies being born left and right, and the people coming into the ER, we hadn't had a chance to take a break together, as we try to do every shift. So when she called, I figured it was to say that she wanted to meet up for a bit to get something to eat in the cafeteria. When I answered, I heard in the background a male voice screaming profanities, and my wife, who was fluent in Spanish, trying to calm this guy down. She told me their pager wasn't working, and they needed security now. I quickly hung up, called for security, told my fellow nurses what was going down, and ran for labor and delivery, worried sick about my wife. When I ran, I almost ran smack dab into the visibly angry man. He wasn't huge, but bro definitely worked out, and not at the gym. He was covered in prison tattoos, and he was obviously a banger. I work out regularly, but I knew this guy could kick my ass. He looked at me, gave me this sick grin, and started heading towards me, spouting off in Spanish. I don't speak fluent Spanish, but what I do understand scared the living shit out of me, so I'm backing up as fast as I can. I start buzzing the door to the ER frantically for them to let me in. This guy's literally a foot away from me, and the door opens and I'm pulled into safety by a doctor. Gangbanger punches the door a few times, making a dragging sign across his throat while grinning at us both. Next thing I know, the police rush into the corridor he's in, and it takes 2 security officers and 2 cops to subdue this dude. I finally make it to my wife, who thankfully was shaken up, but unhurt. She explained to me what happened. A young girl only 14 came in. High fever, vomiting, distended belly. The banger claimed he was her brother, and they needed to cut her open to get her baby. They did an ultrasound, and to their horror they realized that she wasn't pregnant. She had bags of drugs in her stomach. It's very common for drug mules to bring over young women from Mexico carrying their drugs that way. Homeboy freaked out when they informed his sister that she needed emergency surgery, and no, he wasn't getting his drugs. Thankfully, the girl survived. But the sad thing is, she will most likely be getting deported once she recovers. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. If you would like a chance to have your story featured in an upcoming video, make sure you email it to urmaker6260@gmail.com. I hope you're all having a great day, and I'll catch you in the next video. And just remember, it's always scarier if it's true.